My granddaughter hadn't eaten in 3 days. I didn't know that yet when I pulled into my son's driveway on that Thursday afternoon in late October. I just knew something was wrong. I'd known it since Sunday, if I'm being honest with myself. But I kept telling myself I was being an old fool. Kept telling myself she was fine, that they were probably just busy, that my daughter-in-law had probably talked my son into one of those unplugged weekends she was always reading about in her magazines. I told myself a lot of things that week. None of them were true. My son, my boy Elliot, called me every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock. Had done it for 11 years, ever since he moved to Clarksville. Didn't matter if it was a holiday. Didn't matter if we'd just seen each other. Sunday at 7. That was our standing arrangement. He'd tell me about his week, I'd tell him about mine, and then he'd put little Gracie on the phone and she'd talk my ear off about whatever she was obsessed with that week. Butterflies, her kindergarten teacher, the neighbor's cat she'd named Mr. Tat, buttons, even though the cat belonged to somebody else entirely. The Sunday before that Thursday, the phone never rang. I waited until 8, then called him myself. Voicemail. I left a message, told him I hope everything was all right, told him to call me back when he got a chance. Didn't want to sound like I was panicking. Elliot was 34 years old, a grown man. I had no business treating him like a child. Monday came and went. Nothing. Tuesday I called again. Voicemail again. This time I called the house phone. They still had one, which I'd always appreciated, and that rang 12 times before the machine picked up. I left another message. Tried to keep my voice steady. Wednesday I called his office. I knew the number by heart because I'd helped him find that job back when he first moved to Clarksville after everything with his first marriage fell apart. His supervisor, a woman named Delphine, answered on the second ring. She was polite but clipped. Told me Elliot hadn't been in since Monday, that he'd called in sick Monday morning and they hadn't heard from him since. She said it with the careful neutrality of someone who'd already started to be annoyed about it. I thanked her and hung up and sat in my kitchen for a long time. Sick since Monday. Hadn't called in Tuesday or Wednesday. Hadn't returned my calls. Hadn't put Gracie on the phone Sunday night. I thought about calling the Clarksville Police Department and asking for a wellness check. I almost did it. I picked up the phone and put it back down twice. But something stopped me. Not stubbornness, not embarrassment, though maybe there was some of that. It was more that I couldn't shake the feeling that if I called the police and they showed up and everything was fine, my daughter-in-law Petra would never let me forget it. She already thought I was too involved in Elliot's life. She'd said it to him once, not long after they got married, and he'd repeated it to me during one of our Sunday calls, not to hurt me, just because he'd never been good at keeping things to himself. I was trying to respect her boundaries. I was trying. So instead, I got in my truck Thursday morning, drove the 2 hours to Clarksville, and told myself I was just checking in. The house was a small craftsman on Beaumont Street, the kind with a front porch and an old oak tree in the yard that dropped acorns every fall. Elliot used to rake them up with Gracie on weekends. She'd collect the nicest ones in a shoebox and line them up on her windowsill like they were precious things. When I pulled up, Elliot's car was in the driveway. Petra's was gone. I sat in my truck for a moment. The oak tree was shedding. Acorns scattered across the front walk. Nobody had raked. That bothered me more than it probably should have. I knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Louder. Nothing. The front door was unlocked. I don't know why I tried the handle. Something in my gut, I suppose. The same instinct that made me drive 2 hours instead of waiting another day. The door swung open and I stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. Not something rotten, nothing like that, just the staleness of a house that hadn't had its windows opened in days. Dishes in the sink, a cereal bowl on the coffee table with dried milk crusted around the rim. I called out. Elliot's name, Ben Gracie's. My voice sounded strange in that quiet house. Too loud. Nothing. I walked through the living room, the kitchen, checked the bathroom. Nobody. The master bedroom was empty, bed half made, one of Petra's cardigans thrown over the back of the chair like she'd just stepped out. Then I heard it. A small sound. So small, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A kind of shuffle, barely there, coming from the direction of Gracie's room. I walked down the hall slowly. Her door was closed. I knocked once, gently, and said her name. Silence. Then the shuffle again. I opened the door. Her room was dim, curtains drawn. The butterfly mobile above her bed turned slowly in the draft from the hallway. The bed was unmade, and her closet, one of those old sliding door closets, was slightly open. Just an inch, just enough to see darkness inside. I crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled the door back. Gracie was sitting in the corner of the closet behind her winter coats, her knees pulled up to her chest, a stuffed rabbit clutched in both arms. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on in the photo Elliot sent me 2 weekends ago. A pink shirt with a ladybug on it, purple leggings. Her hair was matted. Her lips were cracked and dry. She looked up at me, and I watched her face move through about 6 different expressions in the span of 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and then something that broke me completely open. Relief. Pure, exhausted, desperate relief. Like she'd been holding herself together by a single thread, and I'd just walked in right before it snapped. "Grandpa," she whispered. I was on my knees before I even knew I'd moved. I held her and she shook. She didn't cry, which scared me more than if she had. She just held onto me with both arms around my neck and pressed her face into my shoulder and breathed. I could feel how thin she was under my hands. I could feel her ribs. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" I asked. "Are you hurt anywhere?" She shook her head against my shoulder. "How long have you been in here?" She didn't answer that. I don't think she knew. I carried her to the kitchen. She was too weak to walk steadily, or maybe just didn't want to let go of me, and I didn't push it either way. And I set her on the counter and opened the refrigerator. There wasn't much. Some condiments, a half-empty gallon of milk that was 2 days past its date, a few slices of cheese in a drawer. The pantry had crackers, a jar of peanut butter, a can of soup. From the look of the crackers, she'd been into them. The peanut butter too, a small spoon still stuck in the jar. She'd been feeding herself. A 5-year-old, alone in this house, had been feeding herself crackers and peanut butter out of the pantry. I made her a glass of water and watched her drink it slowly, carefully, like somebody who'd learned to be careful with things. Then I made her a piece of toast. It was all I could find that was quick and safe, and while she ate, I got down on one knee in front of her and said, as calmly as I could manage, "Gracie, honey, where is Daddy?" Her chewing slowed. She looked at me with those big eyes of hers. "Daddy's sleeping," she said. My blood went cold. "Where is Daddy sleeping, sweetheart?" She pointed at the ceiling, then corrected herself, pointed toward the back of the house. "In the garage," she said. "He's been sleeping a long time." I tried to wake him up, but I couldn't. I told her to stay right there on the counter and to keep eating her toast. The door to the attached garage was off the kitchen. I opened it and the smell hit me before I even found the light switch. Not decay, not yet, but something close. Something that made the hair stand up on my arms and told every part of my body that what was on the other side of this was going to change everything. Elliot was in the garage. I'm not going to describe what I found in detail. I can't. Some things a father should not have to put into words. What I can tell you is that my son had been gone for several days, and that it had not been peaceful, and that there was no version of what I was looking at that could be explained by accident or illness. I went back to the kitchen. Gracie was still on the counter eating her toasts, swinging her feet. She looked up at me and said, "Is Daddy still sleeping?" I picked her up and I said, "Grandpa's going to take care of everything, okay? You're safe." Then I stepped out onto the back porch so she wouldn't hear me, and I called 911. The dispatcher kept me on the line. I told her there was a child who needed immediate medical attention, and that I had found a deceased adult male, and that I believed it was not a natural death. I said it like that. Clinical, flat, the way you talk when the other option is falling apart, and you can't afford to. Not yet. Not while Gracie was 10 feet away, eating toast. The paramedics arrived first, then the police. They took Gracie to the hospital in the ambulance. I held her hand until the doors closed, and then I stood in that driveway and watched it pull away and felt the loneliest I have felt in my entire 67 years on this earth. A detective named Ackerman, a quiet, methodical man about my son's age, sat with me in the kitchen for over an hour. I told him everything I knew. The missed calls, the Sunday routine, the call to Delphine at Elliot's office, the unlocked front door, Gracie in the closet. I told him about Petra. I told him her car was gone. He asked me what I knew about her. I told him more than I'd ever said out loud before. Petra had come into Elliot's life 3 years ago, about 18 months after his first divorce. She was younger than him, 28 when they married. She worked in property management and had a way of presenting herself that was all warmth and capability on the surface. But underneath, in the quiet moments, there was something harder, something watchful. I'd noticed it at Christmas 2 years ago, the way she'd gone very still when Elliot laughed too loudly at one of my old stories, not embarrassed. Calculating, like she was filing something away. She didn't like him talking to me. I'd figured that out slowly. The Sunday calls had started feeling shorter. He'd started editing himself, pausing before certain things like he was checking them against some internal list of approved topics. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being paranoid. Elliot had taken out a life insurance policy the previous spring. He'd mentioned it to me once, almost in passing, said Petra had suggested it, made sense with a kid in the house. $250,000. He'd named Petra as the primary beneficiary. I told Detective Ackerman all of it. He wrote it down without expression. Petra was located 2 days later at a Hampton Inn in Bowling Green, Kentucky, about an hour north of Clarksville. She was with a man named Tully, a name I hadn't heard before, though I would hear it many times after. They had checked in on Monday. The same day Elliot's co-worker said he'd called in sick for the last time. I found out later, through Ackerman, that Tully had a record. One prior for assault, charges that had been reduced and eventually dropped. He and Petra had apparently known each other for over a year, long before Elliot ever found out about him. Long before I found Gracie in that closet. The investigation took 3 months. I'm not going to pretend I understood all of it. Forensics, cell phone records, financial records that apparently showed Petra had started moving money out of their joint account 6 weeks before Elliot died. What I understood was the shape of it. What I understood was that my son had been dead for at least 4 days before I got there. That Gracie had been alone in that house for those 4 days, too afraid to leave her room, too confused to know what to do, too young to fully understand what sleeping meant when it went on that long. She'd had crackers and peanut butter and her stuffed rabbit, and 4 days alone in the dark. There are things from this period that I am not ready to write down. The conversation with the funeral home, calling Elliot's mother, my ex-wife Carolyn, who drove up from Nashville and arrived at the hospital still wearing her gardening gloves because she'd come straight from the yard, sitting in a plastic chair next to Gracie's hospital bed while she slept, watching the monitors, thinking about every Sunday night call I'd ever received from him, and trying to hold them all. What I can tell you is that Gracie was physically okay. Dehydrated, underweight for someone who was already small for her age, but no lasting physical harm. The pediatric doctor, a young woman who somehow managed to be both professional and genuinely kind, told me that children are more resilient than we believe, and that Gracie had done exactly the right things. She'd found food. She'd found water. She'd stayed hidden and she'd stayed calm. and she'd made it. I told the doctor that she'd been holding her rabbit the whole time. The doctor said that sometimes one thing is enough. Gracie came home with me to Cookville when she was discharged. She didn't ask about her mother. I don't know if she remembered, in the way that young children sometimes protect themselves from the things that are too large to fit inside their understanding. She asked about Mr. Buttons, the neighbor's cat. She asked if I had butterflies in my yard. She asked if we could stop at McDonald's on the way home, and I said yes, absolutely, anything you want. And she got a Happy Meal and ate the whole thing and fell asleep in her car seat before we hit the highway. I cried the entire drive, silently, so she wouldn't hear me, watching her in the rearview mirror every few minutes, just to make sure she was still there, still breathing, still real. The trial took place the following spring. I was in the courtroom every single day. Petra's defense tried to paint Tully as the sole instigator, argued she'd been coerced, controlled, afraid. The prosecution had cell phone records that told a different story. Text messages between her and Tully going back 14 months. A search on her phone for the life insurance policy terms made 3 weeks before Elliot died. A conversation with Tully 2 days before Monday that prosecutors described to the jury in a flat, careful voice that somehow made it worse than if they'd been dramatic about it. Tully had already taken a plea. He testified against her in exchange for a reduced sentence, second-degree murder, 22 years. Whether that felt like justice depended on which part of you was doing the calculating. For Gracie's sake, I tried to calculate with the parts of me that were still steady. Petra's trial lasted 9 days. The jury deliberated for just over 6 hours. First-degree murder. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no reaction when the verdict was read. She sat very straight, hands folded on the table in front of her, face completely still. I watched her. I'm still not sure what I was looking for. Some flicker of something human in there maybe. Some recognition of what she'd taken. I didn't find it. Her attorney requested a sidebar. The bailiff moved. The room shifted and stirred. And Petra sat there in the middle of it all, still and composed and completely empty, like a woman who had been hollowed out from the inside long before any of this began. The insurance company declined her claim, obviously. In Tennessee, you cannot benefit financially from the death of a person you've been convicted of killing. The policy, the $250,000 that my son had taken out at his wife's suggestion, was frozen and eventually would become part of the estate. And what happened to it legally was something I left to the attorneys, because I couldn't think about money without feeling something dark rise up in me that I didn't want to give room. What mattered was Gracie. She turned 6 that July, 3 months after the trial ended. I threw her a birthday party in my backyard. Nothing elaborate, just a few kids from her new school here in Cookville. Some streamers my neighbor wanted to help me put up because I'd never thrown a birthday party for a 6-year-old girl and had no idea what I was doing. I bought a butterfly-themed cake because of course I did. Gracie laughed so hard at one point that she got frosting on her nose and didn't notice for 10 minutes. I have that moment saved somewhere in my chest. I take it out on the hard nights. She still sleeps with the rabbit. She's in 1st grade now and doing well. Her teacher tells me she's one of the most observant kids in the class, notices everything, always the first one to point out when something has changed. I told her teacher that sounds exactly right. I told her, Gracie has always been good at paying attention to the world around her. I didn't say the rest of it. I think about Elliot every day. I think about the Sunday calls. I think about the last one I actually got. The Sunday before the one he missed, 2 weeks before I drove to Clarksville, and I try to remember if there was anything in his voice, anything I missed, some note of worry or exhaustion that I brushed past because I wasn't listening the right way. I've talked to a counselor about this. She tells me that looking for the signs I missed is natural, but that it doesn't change the outcome, and that my son would not want me to spend whatever time I have left cataloging my own failures. She's right. I know she's right. But some nights I still pick up the phone at 7 o'clock on a Sunday, and I sit with it in my hand and I think about calling him. And then I remember. Those are the nights Gracie comes and finds me in the kitchen. I don't know how she knows. Maybe she hears me get up. Maybe, after everything she's been through, she has simply learned to pay attention to the sounds of a house the way a child should never have to. She climbs up into the chair across from me, her rabbit under her arm, and she says, "Can't sleep, Grandpa?" And I say, "Just thinking, sweetheart." And she says, "Me too." And we sit there together in the kitchen light, and it's not enough, and it's everything. And somehow it keeps being both of those things at the same time. I couldn't save my son. I have to live with that. But I got there when it mattered. And that little girl is asleep down the hole, and the stuffed rabbit is a little more worn than it used to be. And on Sunday evenings at 7 o'clock, I call her name from the kitchen, and she comes running, and we talk. And she tells me everything. That's the call I answer now. That's the one I will never miss.